Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here, and thanks to Intelligence Squared for bringing all of you here for this important debate. I can think of no issue facing our country that's more important to our future, more important to Israel, more important to our Arab partners than the issue of Iran. And I thank Liz for her remarks. It's good to be in the same dais with Liz and Dan. They're former colleagues of mine from the United States government, and Ken as well. We hope to convince you tonight, Ken and I, that actually it's very difficult to say that diplomacy is going nowhere with Iran when we haven't started diplomacy with Iran. I have something to say about this and some familiarity about this. I was for 3 years the point person on Iran, on the negotiations, perspective for Iran, for the United States government, for President Bush. And I never met an Iranian government official during those 3 years, with the exception of a couple of meetings in Baghdad, and these were public meetings, between our ambassador and the Iranian ambassador to Iraq. There were no sustained negotiations between the United States of America and the Iranian government. So we want to convince you that we've got to give diplomacy a chance. We can't give up on diplomacy before we've started diplomacy. I think it's the first thing I'd like to say to you. Second, it is important to remember a little bit of the history that Liz reviewed. We've had 3 decades of a non-relationship with Iran. It's the most unusual diplomatic or non-diplomatic relationship we have in the world. Since the Iranian Revolution, there have been times when American officials have talked to Iranian officials, but there have been no sustained negotiations on the nuclear issue and even on any other issue for many, many years. That's not a situation that we should feel proud of. It's certainly not a situation that advances our national interests. We have no diplomatic relations with the government of Iran. We have no business community, American business community in Iran, and haven't for 30 years. There's no major presence of American journalists. So we're in the extraordinary position of looking at a government that arguably poses the greatest challenges to the United States in the Middle East, and yet we know precious little about that government. So that's what this evening's debate is really all about. How to be tough-minded, and I certainly agree with Liz and Dan on that, about the Iranian government, but also there's a twin challenge, a second challenge. How to engage that government sufficiently so that we have a much better understanding of what its bottom line is, of whether or not a deal is possible, about whether or not diplomacy can be successful in this case. President Obama intends to begin negotiations this summer, probably after the June 12th Iranian elections. My successor as Undersecretary of State, Bill Burns, did meet with the Iranians once last year for a couple of hours. But the Obama administration is about to test the proposition that perhaps we should have a more extended discussions with the Iranians, not because we're acting out of naivete, not because we're weak, not because diplomacy is feckless, but because it's in our self-interest to gather information along with the Russians, Chinese, and Europeans, and see if there's some way to maneuver the Iranians, pressure the Iranians away from a nuclear weapons future. I certainly agree that there's a lot to worry about with the Iranians. They are seeking a nuclear weapons capability that would change the balance of power in the Middle East against us. They're funding and directing most of the major Middle East terrorist groups that are a problem for us, for Israel, and for our Arab partners. And because of their proximity to Iraq and Afghanistan, they are fundamentally involved in both countries, and in a way sometimes it's very detrimental to the United States. But the problem I have, and I think the problem all of us have in looking at this question is, have the policies of the Clinton administration and even the administration in which I served, the Bush administration, have they succeeded? Policies of isolating the Iranians, policies of refusing to meet with Iranian government officials, calling for regime change against Iran. I would submit that those policies have not worked. And the test of any American policy is not whether we feel good about them or feel good about giving speeches, it's are they effective? And therefore I think that President Obama is right to embark on a new path. What is that? It's a combination of engagement with Iran and also pushing back against Iran to protect Israel, to protect United States interests. And what would that negotiation look like? The United States, Britain, France, Germany, Russia, and China would be on one side of the table, with Iran on the other. We would be arguing that Iran should cease and desist in its nuclear weapons ambitions, cease and desist in its support for terrorism. The only way to make that point effectively at this point is to stand opposite them and to engage them. Now, I agree with Liz. We've got to be very tough-minded. I think President Obama would be well advised to put a time limit on these negotiations so that the Iranians don't run out the clock. He'd be well advised to keep the military option on the table because that is language that the Iranians would understand, and certainly well advised to say to the Iranians, if negotiations don't work, we are prepared to put draconian economic sanctions on you because we're not going to give up on this fight to make the Middle East safe from an increase in Iranian power. Why try diplomacy? First, it's the only way we will ever know if a peaceful outcome is possible. It's the only way we'll ever know if we can avoid a war in the Middle East. Second, we already have 2 wars underway in the greater Middle East, in Iraq and Afghanistan. Unless it is absolutely necessary, do we Americans want to embark on a 3rd war? Third, negotiations will actually isolate the Iranians. It'll put the United States on the offensive for the first time in a long, long time, and it will actually increase international leverage against the Iranian government. And fourth, we are no worse off if we try diplomacy. Because if negotiations fail, we will be in a much stronger position than I was as the person negotiating with Russia and China and the Europeans to say to them, especially to Russia and China, we did what you asked, we tried diplomacy, now you need to back us in very tough sanctions against the Iranian government. You need to put the weight of your governments behind the United States. We'll be in a much better place to say that, to be convincing about that, if we try diplomacy first. I don't see how we can say that negotiations and diplomacy are going nowhere if we haven't made a concerted attempt to try diplomacy first, backed up by a very tough-minded American policy. Thank you.